The sun had only begun to creep across the horizon when John McAllister rose from his cot in the small cabin that sat lonely against the endless sweep of the prairie, his body stiff from years of working cattle and riding fence lines, his eyes heavy with the weight of silence that had been his only companion for far too long, and though the land stretched wide and beautiful beneath the pale morning light, it offered him little comfort, for solitude was a cruel master, whispering to him at night. In the groan of the wind through the boards of his house and the distant howls of coyotes that circled in the dark, and John had long ago convinced himself that this was the life he deserved, this quiet exile where his only duties were to his cattle, his horse, and the fences that marked his boundaries. He saddled his chestnut gelding, Dusty, with the same slow, practiced motions as always, his weathered hands moving without thought, and he rode eastward toward the far edge of his land where the ground dipped near an old post that had once been used to hold straying cattle, a place he rarely visited except to check the line, and as he rode he let his mind wander in the silence, the creak of saddle leather and the steady rhythm of hooves the only sounds that filled the empty air. The prairie seemed ordinary at first, the same grass bending in the morning breeze, the same hawk circling above, but as John rounded a patch of sagebrush and the post came into view, his heart lurched violently against his ribs, for there, bound cruelly to the splintered timber, was a girl, a young woman whose torn dress hung in tatters, whose dark hair spilled across her shoulders like a curtain of night, and whose body slumped forward in a way that told him she had been there for hours if not longer, her skin pale, her arms lashed above her head so tight that blood streaked down her wrists, her chest heaving faintly as though each breath was a battle she was losing. For an instant John froze in the saddle, stunned, certain his eyes had conjured a vision born of loneliness, some cruel mirage crafted by the rising heat of the desert, but then she moaned, low and broken, a sound that pierced him deeper than any bullet ever could, and he knew she was real, alive, suffering, abandoned by men who had treated her no better than an animal left for vultures. His body moved before his mind caught up, his boots slamming the earth as he leapt from Dusty, the gelding snorting nervously at the scent of blood, and John drew his hunting knife from its sheath and slashed the ropes that bit into the girl's flesh, catching her limp weight as she collapsed into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, fragile as a bird, her head lolling against his chest, her breathing shallow, her lips whispering something he could barely hear, perhaps a name, perhaps a plea, but the words were carried off by the wind. Blood had soaked the fabric near her ribs where some blade or bullet had torn her side, and John felt a surge of helpless rage, knowing that whoever had done this had meant for her to die slowly and alone under the punishing sun. He looked around quickly, scanning the horizon, half expecting to see riders cresting the ridge, outlaws circling back to finish what they started, but the land was empty, silent except for the ragged breaths of the girl in his arms. He had no time to hesitate, no luxury to question what bringing her home might mean, for leaving her here was death certain, and John McAllister, though hardened by solitude and grief, could not let another soul perish if there was a chance to save her. He hoisted her gently onto Dusty, climbing up behind her, holding her against him as he spurred the horse into a steady gallop back toward the cabin, his mind churning with questions he could not yet answer. Who was she, what devilry had left her to bleed on his land, and what storm might follow once word spread that a rancher had taken in a wounded stranger? The girl stirred once, her head pressing weakly against his chest, and he felt her whisper again, the faintest thread of sound, "Help, please," and though the words were nearly lost, they lit a fire inside him he had not felt in years, a flame of purpose, of defiance against the emptiness that had defined his life. By the time he reached the cabin his shirt was damp with her blood, his arms aching from holding her steady, and he carried her inside as though she were made of glass, laying her on his narrow bed, his hands trembling slightly as he tore strips from a clean shirt to bind her wound, heating water over the fire, cleaning the blood as best he could with the tools of a rancher rather than a doctor. She flinched at the touch, her body writhing in pain though she did not wake, and John whispered to her softly, words he had not spoken to another soul in years, assurances that she would be safe now, that he would not let her die, though in truth he did not know if he could keep such promises, for her fever already burned hot beneath his hand and her pulse fluttered like a bird trapped in a cage. As night fell across the prairie and the coyotes began their cries again, John sat beside the bed with his Winchester leaning against the wall, his eyes fixed on the fragile figure lying still except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest, and for the first time in so many years the silence of the cabin no longer felt like solitude but like a waiting storm, for he knew deep in his bones that his life had just changed, that this girl bleeding in his care was not only a mystery but a spark that might draw death and danger down upon him, and yet he could not, would not, turn away from it. John did not sleep that night, his eyes fixed on the girl as though by the sheer strength of his watchfulness he could keep her tethered to life, his ears straining to catch each rasp of her breathing, each faint murmur that slipped past her lips in fevered dreams, and though exhaustion gnawed at him he sat upright in the chair by the bed, the rifle within reach, the lantern casting a pale glow across her pale face, and with every flicker of her eyelids he wondered if she would open her eyes and tell him who she was, where she came from, and what evil had tied her to that lonely post to bleed out like a forgotten soul in the wilderness. Yet dawn came and went without answers, only the slow, fragile rhythm of survival. By mid-morning her fever had risen, her body trembling as sweat dampened her tangled hair, and John worked with the care of a man who had mended broken bones in horses but never tended to such wounds in a woman, pressing cool cloths to her forehead, dribbling water between her cracked lips, whispering words he had not spoken aloud since the days when he had someone to speak them to, and though she did not respond, he thought he felt her hand twitch faintly, as if some part of her clung to his voice. Outside, the ranch carried on in its usual rhythm, the cattle bawled for water, the wind rattled the shutters, the prairie stretched endless and indifferent, but John knew that everything had changed, that the land he had once ruled in silence now held a secret heavy with blood and danger, for whoever had left her could not be far, and if they learned she had survived, they would come, and when they did, he would be ready. He thought back on his years of solitude, the reasons he had chosen this life away from towns and people, the loss that had driven him here, the wife buried beneath the cottonwood tree at the edge of the creek, the child who had never drawn breath, and the silence that had filled his days ever since, and he realized with a jolt that for the first time since that terrible day, he felt something other than emptiness, a purpose, raw and sharp, a need to fight for this girl who had come into his life not by choice but by fate. By evening of the second day her fever broke in a sudden shudder, her body collapsing into a deep sleep that seemed more peaceful than the restless twitching before, and John allowed himself a ragged sigh of relief, though he did not dare celebrate, for her wound still bled when disturbed, and infection could yet steal her life. But when her lips parted at last and her eyes fluttered open just enough to reveal the glimmer of hazel beneath, he felt his heart pound with a force he had not known in years, and he leaned close, speaking low and steady. "You're safe now," he whispered, his voice rough with dust and sleepless nights, "you're on my ranch, and no one's going to hurt you again." The girl blinked, her gaze unfocused, her lips trembling as though to form words, and after a long moment she rasped a name that sent a chill crawling down his spine, Clara, whether her name or another's he could not yet know, but he nodded, repeating it softly as though binding her to the world with sound alone, and she seemed to cling to it, her eyes closing again as she drifted back into sleep. John sat back, his chest tight, his thoughts a storm of questions, but above them all rose a single, unshakable truth: the girl was alive, and as long as she breathed under his roof, he would protect her, no matter what price it demanded of him. That night he loaded cartridges into his Winchester and set it by the door, knowing deep down that outlaws did not leave unfinished business behind, and if she had been left to die on his land, then sooner or later men with cold eyes and cruel hands would ride back across that horizon, and when they did, they would find a rancher who had nothing left to lose except the fragile life of the girl fate had thrown into his arms.